I've played Genshin Impact for a long time, and the one time that I take a break from the game was during 1.5. I was burned out from mining every 3 days and killing every single mob on the map, and I wanted more in Genshin Impact. Then, 1.6 came around, and the Animo legend enters the fold, Kazuha. I didn't know it at the time, but missing Kazuha would be one of the biggest mistakes I would make on my account. Not only is he an amazing support, but he also looks cool as shit. I've since got him now, but honestly, I'm sick of Kazuha. I try to play the MC, my Kazuha does more swirls. I try to play Venti, my Kazuha does more swirls. I try to play Sucrose, my Kazuha does more swirls. I want to play a hyper carry. Their best team has Kazuha. I want to play Raiden, Child, they both want Kazuha. He grabs me by the throat. I swirl for him. I travel for him. I give him Favonius, he isn't satisfied. I pull Zyphos. I don't need this much ER, he tells me. Give me more field time. He grabs Bennett and even the goddess Xiangling and forces himself to become the hyper carry. You just need to pull more. I can deal more damage with Freedom Sworn. I can't pull for Freedom Sworn. I don't have enough Primo Gems. Wait a second. I've given him freedom. Wait, what else does he want? He grabs my credit card, it declines. Guess this is the end. He grabs himself and says, Kazuha, slash! There is no hint of sadness or malice in his eyes. Nothing but pure, unadulterated, swirling power. What a cruel world. Putting that aside, let's put the bias down and talk about Kazuha. What makes Kazuha great is how versatile he is. His grouping is the main reason why he excels in every Abyss lineup. If you can deal your damage to all targets at once, then the DPS check to clear those floors drops by an insane value. That's where Kazuha's skill comes into play. The Kazuha suck is really an amazing skill. You can suck in midair, it's great for exploration, and whenever you suck, you will create a suction vortex that sucks enemies in. The great thing about this suck is that it has two versions of sucking. If you care to play the game properly, you can either do his holding suck technique to group enemies in a large range, or if it's a boss or something like that and the enemies are already grouped up, then you can use his tap suck technique. Kazuha is just the king of sucking enemies. His elemental burst, Kazuha Slash, is a nice AoE burst that does damage, infuses an element, and keeps his buff active. Speaking of which, let's talk about his buffs. His A4 passive will amp up whatever element he swirls for 8 seconds. This seems short, but when his burst is also swirling, it will refresh the duration. So his burst lasts about 8 seconds, and the duration is more like 16 seconds when you actually activate it for this damage boost. Sometimes, however, you may not want to activate his burst, but we'll talk about those instances later. You're looking at a 4% damage increase per 100 EM, which is why you want to stack EM on Kazuha. At 1000 EM, he gives a 40% damage increase to each element that he swirls. If you manage to master double swirling, then that's a massive buff that you could take advantage of for all of your party members. But just how important is double swirling? Double swirling with Kazuha is a true skill check. Sometimes it can be easy, sometimes it can be impossible. There are many teams that just don't double swirl with Kazuha. It isn't a requirement, but if you want to squeeze out more damage, then you will want to use it. It's a little harder to do in certain vape and freeze comps, but definitely manageable. Firstly, the rule for Vape Swirl is that when you're using a Vape team, the staple characters are normally going to be Hydro character, Kazuha, and Bennett. Most of the time anyways. And Kazuha has a priority when he's swirling, and that priority is Pyro. Because of this, when he uses his burst in Bennett's field, he will infuse Pyro. So firstly, use Xingqiu or Double Hydro, or just don't bother using Kazuha's burst when you have a Pyro main on the field. There is a way around it, but let's go back to how the rotation works for now, and then we'll explain that a little later. You want to apply enough Hydro and just enough Pyro so that you can double swirl. This goes into the elemental gauge theory, so I'll try to make this as simple as possible. When you use Xingqiu, you will apply enough Hydro so that when Bennett uses his burst, you will not delete the Pyro aura. When you use Kazuha's skill in this case, you will do the hold version. Sometimes you can do the tap version, but the hold version is more reliable. And you will swirl the hydro off of the enemy while infusing pyro and applying pyro on the way back down. At the moment, you have only swirled hydro, getting the damage buff for hydro, but not pyro in this case. You have only infused pyro, but the buff is only gained when you swirl pyro off of the enemy. Once you activate Kazuha's burst, then you have successfully double swirled. Other cases are Child's E into Bennett burst, and then you follow the same process. Another thing that you can do in an area of effect situation, you can actually just apply hydro to one enemy and then apply pyro to the other enemy, and then you can get your double swirl that way. That is definitely probably the easiest way actually to get that off. If you're not using Xingqiu or Child, however, things become a bit more complicated. Kazuha's burst in Minette's field applies so much pyro that only Xingqiu or maybe C2 Yelan can keep up with normal pyro characters enabling the vape. Diluc is much easier to keep up with because he doesn't apply that much pyro, but characters like Yoimiya and Dia will have trouble vaping their hits, especially when Kazuha infuses pyro into Minette's burst. So you could either let the hydro unit vape, which is normally fine if using a character like Yelan or Furina, or you can just not use Kazuha's burst and double swirl naturally. One element at a time. Another option is to swirl hydro and use your burst to infuse hydro. This will let your pyro characters vape, but you will be missing out on the buff from his passive. If you have his C1 or are using a sacrificial sword, then you unlock a new tactic. You can swirl hydro, and then you can apply just enough pyro to swirl right before your main DPS hits the field. It's very difficult to do in certain situations and requires exact proper rotations, but it's manageable. Whew, that was a lot of information. All in all, double swirling other characters are a bit more complicated, and you can normally just swirl one at the start of the rotation, then the other. Double swirling will be a decent damage increase for your sub DPS, especially if they're units like Yelan, Furina, etc. It's a little easier in teams like Electro Charge because you just apply Hydro first and then Electro and then just swirl both at the same time. But that also kind of follows the same thing as earlier when you can apply Pyro to one enemy and then Hydro to the other. Let's move on from these double swirl shenanigans. At the end of the day, double swirl if you want to be optimal, and if you don't care, then literally just don't. You'll still be able to clear much faster with his base grouping. If you've made it this far, then you must be enjoying the video, right? Go ahead and leave a like and you will be showing a lot of support for the channel. Consider subscribing for more guides and videos just like this one. Now, let's return to the video. Now, normally I talk about builds and weapons first, but Kazuha's Constellations, especially his C1, will change the way that you want to build him. His C1 lets you reset the cooldown on your skill when you burst, which is a massive spike in energy. It also straight up cuts off about a second of his cooldown. This will almost eliminate his ER requirements because he can get a ton of energy quickly. He still needs a bit of ER, but I've never had an issue bursting with Kazuha at around 130%. You want to get those in your substats. His C2 is a giant buff. He gets 200 EM for himself, and then the on-field character also gets 200 EM. This will really increase the damage of reaction-based teams like Vape and even boost his damage amping, as you'll get about an extra 8% damage increase to whatever is swirled, and each reaction will be hitting much harder. It's a good stopping point if you love Kazuha, but it's not required. I've got this over 2 reruns because Kazuha is just so much fun for me, but he is perfectly fine at C0. You can get a pseudo C1 by using Sacrificial Sword, and you can get a pseudo C2 by using like Nahida, even though Nahida also stacks with Kazuha, but you know, you get the point. His C4 is kind of nice, but it basically is not required, and it basically makes his ER requirements essentially 0. Every time that you use his E, you'll get 3 to 4 energy if he has less than 45 energy total. And over a full rotation, that's about 6 to 8 energy refunded immediately. Also, he gets energy back as he glides, which won't really happen in combat, but I guess it's kind of useful. Now, Kazuha C6 is something I've wanted for a time, but after doing some research, it's not that good. It turns Kazuha into a main DPS unit for sure, but it's just not really possible for me to really use all too well. What it does is that when he uses his skill or burst, you get an Animo infusion for 5 seconds, and all of his EM actually boosts his normal attack damage and charge attack. But his infusion can be overridden, so it's basically worthless, as Bennett is one of the best team options. My Bennett is C6, and that's just not going to really work out. He can work in other teams like Thundering Fury, but he still won't be doing that much more than he was already. It's a fun game style, but compared to things like C6 Xiao, C6 Dia, or even C6 Eula, the damage potential isn't that high. If you're a hardcore Kazuha main, then you will find it to be very fun, but it's basically a Kuching type gameplay. And if you don't have Bennett C6, then you'll be able to get much more damage out of it. But if I want to do a main DPS Kazuha, I can just do Pyro Kazuha, for example. So basically all of Kazuha's constellations can kind of be solved by using other characters or weapons, so just keep that in mind. There is but one option for Kazuha when it comes to artifacts though, and that is 4-piece Viridescent. This will boost the damage even further for whatever you swirl, and this is going to be his go-to set 90% of the time. If you want to run main DPS Kazuha, or you want to run him with C6 Faruzan, then he has a few different options. I personally love running Thundering Fury Kazuha. You get his skill for days and it's quite fun, especially when you're using Sacrificial Sword along with his C1. You can run either an Electro Charge variant of the team or an Aggravate team. You really want to have him having 2-piece attack and 2-piece Animo damage if he's running with C6 Faruzan as well. Depending on the team, you will probably want full EM 90% of the time. With Faruzan, you'll definitely want to switch to an attack, Animo damage, crit damage set. EM is to ensure that his damage is boosted to most of the team, so you will really not be using attack unless you're going for a pure Animo team. Now, his so-called signature weapon. Let's pick back up that bias that I dropped off like 10 minutes ago. To be honest, I hate this weapon. It's the ugliest signature weapon ever created. Kazuha, a character that's red and black, is going to get a blue and gold weapon. I don't understand the design choice, especially when his story quest gives him an amazing looking weapon that fits him perfectly, but that weapon is actually kinda bad on him. Definitely usable, but he has so many better options. It's disgraceful that such an amazingly designed character gets a horrible signature weapon. Now, is the weapon good? Well, yes, with caveats. Kazuha needs energy recharge, and a decent amount of it if you don't have his C1. If you have his C1, then this weapon is going to be great. He will perform better with ER weapons because it's better to have his burst active than to get the buff from Freedom Sworn most of the time. You also don't want to run ER Sands because he really wants his triple EM pieces. You can definitely just get the weapon and run him with an ER Sands, but Kazuha just doesn't really need it. For those whales out there, the weapon is how certain characters hit massive damage, because the damage amp from an R5 of this weapon is massive, but from R1, it's good, very decent actually, but it's just not that required. He has much more affordable and arguably better weapons such as Favonia's Sword, Sacrificial Sword for that pseudo C1 effect, and Zyphos if you have it. I personally love using Zyphos as it gives my entire team some energy recharge. It's pretty nice honestly. If you use any EM or ER sword on him, then you'll be just fine, but definitely aim for either Favonia's, Zyphos, or Sacrificial Sword. Kazuha quite literally has a million teams where he can work in. Vape, Freeze, Aggravate, there are just so many. I've been showing a lot of clips of different teams in this video, so you could take inspiration from one of those. He is such a versatile unit that you could bring him in any of these teams and simply just use it for crowd control. Like, if I want to use Mono Geo but I need a little bit of grouping, I'll just throw in Kazuha instead of like Albedo and I'll do perfectly fine with that. So have at it seeing where you can't use him, because trust me, he fits into 90% of teams like a glove. So Kazuha is a jack of all trades, master of, well, a lot. As I mentioned, he's a versatile animal unit that I think everyone should have at least C0. He is one of those characters that can completely change the state of your account if you have him built, like Bennett or Xingqiu. You have other options or side grades like Sucrose and Venti, but Kazuha just does it better in certain situations. Sucrose is definitely competitive with Kazuha, but Kazuha is just more comfy to use. And Venti is far superior in certain teams, but Kazuha will have better suction in other teams. It really depends. All in all, I think that if you don't have him, you should pick him up. He may be added to the Chronicle banner next, so if you're saving for Arlecchino, it may be worth waiting. If you have a surplus of Primo Gems lying around, then Kazuha will be a great support for Arlecchino. Still here? Great. Since you've made it this far, you should go ahead and just like the video and consider subscribing if you really enjoyed it. We are nearing the 5K milestone for subscribers, so thank you so much for all of the recent support. Until next time, Enigma out.